James Jabinal, currently in the Office of Information Operations Policy, ASD SOLIC, in the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Also with me, Lieutenant Colonel Jeremiah Root, Major Brad Hampton, and Major Drake Toney. Quick background for me, I was previously the Deputy Director for the Marine Corps Civil Military Operations School in Quantico, Virginia, and we were and are responsible for all Marine Corps formal CA training. I was also the OP field manager for civil affairs. I then became the integration branch deputy for the information maneuver division for the deputy commandant for information. I am also a civil affairs officer in the Marine Corps Reserve. Lieutenant Colonel Jeremiah Root is currently the S9 OIC for influence operations at the Marine Corps Information Operations Center. He was an LNO to MAR4 Cyber in JTF Ares and the China Outcomes Group. He was formerly a CMO planner with US Northcom's Interagency Coordination Cell and a CA officer and team leader with 3rd Civil Affairs Group. Lieutenant Colonel Root has also attended the PSYOP-Q course and is in the first tranche of the newly created 1707 Influence Officer as a primary MOS. Major Brad Hampton is currently the Marine Corps' representative to the Principal Information Operations Advisor cross-functional team. The cross-functional team is responsible for writing and editing the next DoD strategy for OIE and the subsequent implementation plan. Formerly a PSYOP officer and the PSYOP OC field manager, Major Hampton is also in the first tranche of 1707 influence officers and was also formerly a ground intel officer. Our third panelist is Major Drake Toney. He is a civil affairs officer with the Force Headquarters Group, supporting exercise and expertise in OIE at the operational level of war. As a civilian, he leads global trust and safety for Spotify. He brings expertise from the public and private sectors with previous civilian GS experience as the Deputy Director of Plans and Strategy for the Deputy Commandant for Information. He was also a Global Lead Service Strategy and Information at Twitter. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Everyone in the audience, thank you for being with us today. If you weren't part of the component updates from yesterday, what the Marine Corps has done is they have created an influence officer and influence specialist primary MOS on the active duty, for the active duty component. It has not been implemented on the reserve component just yet. So what makes an influence officer and influence specialist? Basic training path is the Civil Affairs Officer course, the PSYOP-Q course, and the OIE course for the Marine Corps at EWTG Lant in Norfolk, Virginia. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we'll get right into it. Lieutenant Colonel Root, Major Hampton, each of you took different routes to becoming an influence officer. Brad, you were a PSYOP officer first, and conversely, Jeremiah, you were a CA officer first. Can each of you discuss your thoughts about each capability initially when you first became a PSYOP officer or a CA officer, and has your opinions about CA and or PSYOP changed over time? Jeremiah, you want to take that first?
To see which one of us wanted to jump on that one first, so I will go ahead and take it. Thanks. Obviously, like you said, I started out in the reserve, so listening yesterday to some of the conversations was really interesting because I could understand some of the considerations and concerns that some of the reserve CA side had from the Army, having observed it. A little bit of background before that, I worked in the Security Force Assistance Advisor realm. I worked at the Advisor Training Group, Advisor Training Cell, and as an advisor, and as a like a CERC officer in Afghanistan. And that's really what got me interested in the civil affairs piece. Now that was all on active duty. And then I went into the reserves to join the civil affairs specifically because my understanding of it was such a unique capability for the Marine Corps that was underutilized. So I went to the reserves specifically with the interest of moving into the civil affairs. The thing about Marine Corps civil affairs, even with the new 17XX OC field, is even though there's civil affairs groups exist in the reserves, it's still secondary for them. So it does have a lot of its own drawbacks, but I was really interested in the warrior diplomat focus that the civil affairs groups have in the reserves, which they continue to have. And I think now, having come back on active duty permanently for the return to active duty program and being a PSYOP officer, now influence officer, it was a great perspective to have. And I do think that my understanding of how to work with the CAGs could definitely have better integration going forward for future implementation. I don't want to dominate this. I'll turn over just a second.
I'll go ahead and I think take it over to me, James. Is that right?
Yeah, over to you, Brad.
Okay. So became a PSYOP officer in early 2018 and took the psychological operations company for about 2.5 years at McKayok. So one of the first things that I did actually before I took the company was I took a detachment of 8 Marines out to Bala-Katan 2018. Got out there having just graduated the PSYOP course, thinking I was going to go do some serious influence, and realized there were no authorities to execute built into that plan. So linked up with some civil affairs Marines, the reservists that were brought in for the civil affairs support, and essentially went into support mode for them. And going into that, I was had dealt with civil affairs in the past in Afghanistan and then out in 5th Fleet. Wasn't exactly sure what they did, had a pretty myopic scope on it until I got on the ground in the Philippines. And I saw essentially what potential they had, right? So out building a school, really expanding a school in central Luzon near Tarlac City. And civil affairs guys are, engaging, doing the KLE thing. And one of the things that I thought was lacking, but that had a ton of potential, was the fact that when they were doing their KLE, there wasn't a way to broadcast that to a broader community because of the lack of MISO authorities to do so. So the civil affairs on the ground, I thought they did a really good job locally. I thought, what was lacking on that was the integration of the broader ability to push out the information that, that the U.S. military, there was a Navy CBs and Army engineers there as well. We're working with the Japanese, the locals, and they were doing something for the good of the community, and it wasn't really making it to a broader audience. And so that's kind of the first time as a PSYOP officer, having not been to civil affairs yet, that I understood the role of PSYOP. I saw CA's capability and kind of recognized that there's an information projection gap that existed between the two. And in fact, when I came back from that, took the company over, me and James started having discussions within the Marine Corps about how do we create this influence officer, pairing, from my perspective at the time, pairing the ability to do, civil military operations, but then looking at how do we broadcast that to a larger population for purpose. And that was kind of the genesis of the 1707 push that I had from my position. And I wasn't the first guy to think about it. There was Steve Howell, retired Major Steve Howell, and a few other people that were providing input to it. But from my position there at the company, I really recognized the effects that could be achieved through the integration of these two capability areas. So that's kind of where I came from on the PSYOP thing and into civil affairs, and recognizing the mass potential of the two. I'll turn it back over to you, James, if I think that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Brad. Of course, I have scripted questions, so I'll run through those, and we'll do some follow-up and also take questions from the chat room. Full disclosure, as Brad alluded, I've known him for some years now. I've known Jeremiah for a few years now. and I've known Drake for a few years now. But Drake, Major Toney, you bring unique experience to the table as a CA officer from the private sector and as a GS deputy director at the Deputy Commandant for Information. In fact, MCDP8, which Aaron mentioned yesterday and that Jeremiah dropped in the chat, MCDP8 for Information was the main output of your division at DCI. So I don't want to box you in because you're a strategic thinker, not that Brad and Jeremiah aren't, but what are your general thoughts on how CA can and should contribute to information as a warfighting function?
Hey, James, thanks for that. Just making sure folks can hear me. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for that, and glad to see Lieutenant Colonel Root dropping some things here in the chat beyond MCDP8, the article from the Gazette, a little bit of a collaboration between Mr. Eric Shaner, the principal writer for MCDP8, and General Glavy, then also looking at the tri-service strategy. Another major output of our time, or at least the time that I had the privilege of being at Deputy Commandant for Information, was the classified annex in looking at the tri-service, maritime strategy. So maritime power in the information environment, that's classified annex to kind of the advantage at sea strategy. So there's a lot of, I guess, good work that's kind of getting out there. Certainly the team had a chance to work on kind of the joint concept for competing, the joint concept for information advantage with the J7 as well. So there was a lot of kind of, I guess, good thought and good discussion going on. And it really kind of centered and anchoring on this idea of like, what does information mean in the context of a warfighting function, like the things that people do, how does that relate? I'll just say that my comments don't reflect big Marine Corps. They certainly also don't reflect my current employer, Spotify, or previous Twitter. So just get that out there. I think it's been very interesting to kind of work on kind of global platforms in my day job. So thinking about the content moderation approach and some of the response to abuse and online harm and potential offline harm at a platform like Twitter and now at Spotify, and then thinking about like the role that information can play when weaponized or as part of complex geopolitical events, right? Whether it's in a military context or not. And so what I think CA really does a good job of is kind of this notion of everything being connected, right? The lenses that we look at problems, the way we think about the connected nature of populations, of their government, of kind of the circumstances that form their environment. I think that's something that folks are starting to gain a larger appreciation for, right? As we think about like global competition and the connected nature of things like the authorities to operate, our standing and how we're viewed within nations, et cetera. And I think like we can kind of go beyond that and thinking about the nuance. So I think Civil Affairs does a pretty good job of teasing out some of that nuance. But, as we are writing things like MCDP8, or as we're talking about some of these like joint naval doctrine, I was certainly often an unpopular person in the room, bringing up that you're not just competing with bad actors or even nation states, right? You're competing with everyone who can demand information or demand attention in an attention economy. So that's advertisers, folks in the popular music or entertainment space, really everyone. And so like the kind of nature of things with the emergence of digital media, increased consumption rates, even in the most developing countries of online content. We're seeing these weird kind of dynamics of what used to be sociologically behind the kind of curtain behaviors becoming very much front and center, scale problems of bad actors being able to harness devices to gain immense reach or kind of prolonged exposure. And I think it's just another piece of that nuanced fabric that civil affairs professionals should be able to kind of highlight to operational leaders. So I think one of the things also that I shouldn't, just tell you about why I'm so unpopular, but I think it's a set of skills that needs to be scaled across the entire force. And I have my own kind of concerns about us getting highly specialized folks to think about things like information and civil affairs. I think as we think about, looking at the doctrine for standing forces, or if you look for some of these advanced concepts, the idea that every set of hands isn't contributing to these types of problems or these types of service offerings seems a little silly to me. I think they become scaled skills that need to be across the force and baked into part of our service offering. And so that's where I'll end. I kind of started to say it's my perspective on how kind of we think about civil affairs, or how we think about information, or some of these other kind of like domains and specialties, is certainly informed by what I do most days of the year. And thinking about things like scaled abuse, targeted harassment, terrorism, election mis and disinformation, a lot of the surfaces in which are exploitable are, the front presented pieces of the product, and stopping things like problematic content online comes from solving root cause issues and thinking about the root cause. And I think, again, civil affairs is a community well poised to do something like that, but we need to really embrace that. Our kind of recommendations to commanders, to strategy, to approaches need to be much more aimed at the root and not the leaves. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to take kind of our way of thinking, our conceptualization of operating spaces, and scale that more.
Hey, thanks for that, Major Toney. You mentioned, thanks for talking about information writ large. And then you also mentioned domain. And I think we would be remiss if we were talking about information without talking about cyberspace. JP 3TAC12 on cyberspace operations states that given that cyberspace is wholly contained within the information environment, and the chief purpose of information operations, which is a dead term now, thanks to the JP for information. The purpose of information is to create effects in the information environment. There is significant interdependency between IO and cyberspace operations. And then it's also worth noting that JP 3TAC57 lists cyberspace as an enabling operation of CMO. So in my experience, oftentimes IO is incorrectly synonymous with MISO. So for all of you, and we'll just keep the normal rotation, Jeremiah, Brad, and Drake, do you see cyber as a domain that CA can contribute in? And if so, what would be effective ways for CA to integrate with cyberspace operations?
It's a good question. First, I'd like to say, absolutely, I do think that there could be integration there. One of my experiences was, I was a G39 up at More4 Cyber, and then I worked with Task Force Ares and China Outcomes Group, doing some integration for everything that goes into a G39 with cyber. And at More4 Cyber, just to reiterate, I mean, their main priority is to defend and extend, and then when directed, they can do offensive cyber operations. And they really want to enable freedom of action across the warfighting domains and deny the same to the adversary. But really what we're talking about when we're talking about cyber, and I had this argument with a lot of people at cyber who think only in ones and zeros and ones, is you're delivering a cognitive effect most of the time. And so, yes, you're doing cyber, but you're presenting some sort of cognitive effect that somebody on the other end is going to interpret. Now, I don't know where some people fall out on the cyber piece, but largely from what I saw they were doing, they needed to articulate some sort of cognitive piece. And I dropped an article into the chat discussion from the DCI, I think it was the Information Warfighting Function or Information Advantage. But really, he talks about the importance of capability and tradecraft, authorities, approval, placement, and access. And then two additional terms I would throw out there that I learned from the China Outcomes Group as being a priority dealing with cyber is resources and infrastructure. But if you look at civil affairs and civil military operations, and then those pieces together, there's absolutely crossover for where one has authorities and the other one has access and placement, and the other one has resources and infrastructure. So if you look at it from that lens, I think there's absolutely a place for it. And I'll turn it over to Brad.
Hey, thanks, sir. Yeah, agree completely. And I think that when we view it, the analogy that or not the analogy, the kind of the story I told earlier about the civil affairs in the Philippines, I look at now what some of our cyber forces are doing as far as propagation of information, right? So when we look at assuring allies and competing for neutrals, if you will, we need to make sure that they're seeing the things that we're doing, right? If we want to be the preferred partner of choice, I think that not utilizing the cyber domain, writ large by propagating, the great things we're doing with our partners and allies in those regions to other people that may want to be our partners and allies, we're just missing a huge opportunity in the, in the competition space. So I view it from a domain, not necessarily like a cyber operator jamming ones and zeros on, but how do we utilize the domain to propagate the information in order to achieve the, the influence we're looking for. Anytime we do a good thing, right, it doesn't have to be some sort of complete MISO series with MISO executions, but we would be remiss if we did not just let everyone know we were doing a good thing, right? And then propagate that to other countries or people that may also be interested in working with us. So that's kind of my view on how cyber should be integrated with CMO activities.
Okay, a lot of thoughts here because I think Colonel Root, excellent point, right? When you start thinking about if you think about a strategy or approach and ends, ways, and means, right? Resources and infrastructure are kind of the key place, right? And like the surfaces where you can actually have impact. And, maybe just, we think about it from our perspective in DoD, which I'll get to, or like within the U.S. Marine Corps. But, I think about, recently Brazil just had, right, an election, right? A pretty successful one, no doubt, free from interference. And one of the things that in 2016, obviously there were a number of elections, but Brazil's election, there was a significant amount of investment by the government and liaison work with folks when I was at Twitter, and then also, of course, at Meta. In kind of trying to counter some of the mis and disinformation tampering that could happen aligned with elections following kind of the DOJ findings from our own in the US. And bad actors completely circumvented Facebook and Twitter and used WhatsApp. And that was the kind of principal surface that was used for kind of mis and disinformation in 2016's elections in Brazil. And so like what I want to bring that up, I guess that anecdote for two reasons. Like one, when we talk about kind of like this access, like there's like access and ability to operate right within like the context of the platforms, I think you're going to find increasing challenge within the US DoD space as companies are, actually driving towards more compliance with country specific or regional specific laws. We can talk about whether that's good or not. It probably should be more of a global standard, but malign, what we call malign behavior, right? Like companies are now kind of confronting all nation states can participate in malign activity or manipulation or maybe kind of like problematic behavior, and that includes the US. And so like I know that folks in cybercom and folks in other entities within our space have found themselves what they may say handcuffed recently because we are holding US to similar standards as other countries. So I think like back to kind of like where I started in the last question about the information environment or about civil affairs, right? Like this context and nuance and understanding, I think access and into these spaces and understanding these spaces and understanding the infrastructure in which, kind of the communication or prolonged exposure happens, it's critical. And I think that comes from our kind of cyber capabilities. And the last thing before I get kind of like through the answer is just like the the foot stop and the plea to remember that like a lot of these surfaces are global, right? They are not just US, maybe potentially owned and operated, but they are globally accessible, and that folks that are operating these spaces have really thoughtful kind of networks of and tools that they use to perpetrate bad activities. And we don't necessarily have the counter tools on a US government or global kind of superpower scale. And so that makes it really difficult. Civil affairs professionals, I think, can be really helpful in interpreting like what it is that we're seeing and maybe strategic approaches. But when we talk about resources and infrastructure, when we talk about the access to the space surfaces, it's really a cyber problem, and I think a space problem in the future, and something that like is going to be worth a lot of discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen, for all of that. Moving on, Lieutenant Colonel Root, you were a reserve CA for a few years, and then you completed a return to active duty package. And Major Hampton, you gave a great vignette about working with CA while you were a PSYOP officer. What do you think are some ways that these civil affairs groups, the reserve civil affairs groups, can integrate with OIE broadly? Or how do you even see the relationship between the active component influence officers and influence specialists with the reserve component civil affairs Marines?
Well, I'll go ahead and start that. Sorry for the background child screaming noise, if you can hear that. So yes, I started out, as I mentioned before, in the reserves, and I'm now back on active duty. And I think it's a great perspective, as I mentioned earlier, because I'm actually in the works with one of the CAGs from through my kayak to try to have that better integration. And I think that it's, sorry about the noise. I think that's very important to have that integration piece there. And I think that it's necessary. And I also think that the active component leadership need better inculcation on what the CAGs offer, because we can talk about relevancy, and I think the CAGs are relevant, and I think civil affairs is relevant, but it's only as relevant if the leadership understand it. It's the value of a tool is its utility. So your ability to understand how to use that tool, it creates the relevancy for you. And so I think that's part of the problem. We need to better educate some of our active duty component leadership on employing these tools. I'll turn over to Brad.
Hey, thanks, sir. I'm actually going to just jump directly off from that point. In the creation of 1707, in theory, right, our senior leadership, guys like Lieutenant Colonel Root, they should be able to advocate for that capability, right? One of the big problems we've had in the employment of the reserve forces is, who is saying the Marine Corps has this capability, and you can employ them in this TSC event, and this, in this deployment, on this ARGMU, whatever the case may be, up to the Joint Force Commander that has all of the authorities to both ask for the capability and then employ it in a manner in which he's achieving his objectives. So I think bridging that gap to our senior leaders to employ that capability out of the reserves is one of the real critical gaps in what the CAGs are doing, and what for what purpose. And then the other part is the one of the things that I think will be very useful is that depending on which way the civil affairs goes for the Marine Corps, that can be a landing spot for our 1707s, even if they just transition, essentially into the reserves as a straight civil affairs, Marine, as opposed to an influence Marine on the active side. At least it still gives us that pool to draw from, and we're not just losing guys, especially in this realm right now. It's First IO and some of these other organizations that hire contractors. I think they have First IO's got 8 or 10 of my former PSYOP guys because they pay them way better and they do, quite frankly, cooler things. So having now a landing point where we can still retain that capability, we don't just lose it, I think bridges a gap for capacity as well.
Thanks for that, Brad. So early stages for the influence MOSs, and I'm sure there's going to be refining in the out years. Drake, did you want to take that question on, or do you want to talk about your thoughts about the active component influence officer and influence specialist being in the reserve component?
Yeah, I guess a couple of thoughts, and it really kind of goes into what Brad was saying. I think, you know, I know I'm not the commandant of the Marine Corps, and I'm really, you know, Joe Nobody in the Marine kind of structure now. But if I were, right, king for a day, I would make it my principal focus to get hired and paid to do more jobs, right? The Marine Corps writ large, we should be getting hired and paid to do more jobs for the Joint Chiefs and for the COCOMs. And, you know, I think about that within the reserve context as well, right? So it makes it difficult for us to get hired and paid to do more jobs if we have really difficult training and education pipelines, if there's a lot of qualifications and barriers to entry, if we have limited access to talent or pipelines that drive things that way. And my concern is that we are, you know, we kind of continue to sign ourselves up for those things, right? Whether, you know, we're supporting, you know, SOCOM and like our MARSOC pipelines, supporting the IC and what we need to do for our CI HUMIT folks, or certainly even in this space, you know, the less that we can actually control, or we have the resources to generate forces, to train them, to get them employed, you know, I think we may, that's something that needs to be front and center as we're designing here. And then I also think the function of the reserves is changing. I think there is a real opportunity to look at like what we get hired to do as a reserve component. And I think some of it, not just to be, you know, the follow on, you know, force to come off the bench and replace the active component as they stand, right? Like, we have varying different experiences. We have different kind of access and perspectives. And I think there's some real opportunity as we think about a future reserve that augments a persistent active component rather than just backfills in times of extraordinary crisis. I think we might do well to think about that. So there's probably a lot to unpack there, but I think, you know, folks are trying to make the incremental change to create pathways, create opportunities, remove some of those barriers. And I think that's net good. I think we just need to be realistic about, you know, what is going to get, if I'm competing for my service, right? If I'm competing with the 82nd Airborne, like what is going to get the Marine Corps hired for those jobs, if that's what the business we want to be in, you know, et cetera. So that's, I guess, a layman's opinion on the question you asked, James.
Can I touch on that one more piece? That's just to reiterate something that said, the beauty of the 1707, 1751, the influencer MOSs on the active duty side really is, as Brad said, it creates an advocate for it and knowing where and how to employ these resources. So before, where you might have an exercise and no one even told the civil affairs group about it, you're going to know, hey, you can bake it into the process and be like, we got to get these guys out here, try to work it into like an AT or something so they can come out and be part of this. And then the 1707, 1751s are going to continue their whole career. I mean, I have the first second lieutenant that ever came out of the basic school as a 1707 now, waiting to go through training. Their whole pipeline will be this field that they can understand and professionalize themselves. So it's just going to be great to have that out there. And so that, so long as they both understand each other, it will be great for integrating the reserve component.
Jeremiah, I mean, you're the senior 1707 in the Marine Corps. You can jump in whenever you want to, brother. You did touch on direct entry into the MOS. Brad, can you just give a quick, I know Aaron talked about the MOS a little bit yesterday. Can you talk about the different pathways to becoming an influence officer and influence specialist as it stands today?
Yeah, I can. And I'm pretty sure Captain John Holmes is on, who's the current OCFILD, you know, what the 1707 that I kind of developed and handed off to IMD, he actually works day to day. But, you know, as I understand, and John, please jump in, from the officer side, you know, initially it's going to be a lateral move into it as we build out our first, you know, tranche of officers, which there's a total of 28 between now and next summer through the lat move process. And then we'll be growing second lieutenants, much like we do any other occupational field, right? They'll come out of TBS. They will stay in the OC field for their career. And then, you know, once we grow this out to our end state is 198 officers and 299 enlisted, somewhere around FY 30 or 31. as we grow it to that point, the lateral move process will decline over the out years, and the initial entrance through the second lieutenants will be the baseline. And then on the enlisted side, it's a lateral move only. I believe you can apply as a corporal. If you are assessed and selected, you can then get promoted to sergeant shortly thereafter, but it's a sergeant and above only MOS. So those are the two pipelines for the officers and enlisted. And I would ask Captain Holmes to jump in if I either left something out or screwed something up.
No, sir, that about covers it. For the next 8 to 10 years, there'll be a lateral move requirement from, call it, senior first lieutenant up to lieutenant colonel. Obviously, we'll start tailoring it off at the higher ranks first, but there will be pretty much a perennial lat move requirement, as well as an accession requirement through the basic school. The 1707 MOS, we assigned 2 this year. We're looking at 8 to 10 next year, which will be kind of the standard from then on. So it'll be at a rate of about 1 per company, kind of the same rate as some of the Intels or some of the other lower density MOSs. And then for enlisted folks, it remains a lat move MOS, just like Major Hampton discussed.
Thanks for that, Captain Holmes. And for everyone who don't know what the basic school is, every Marine Corps officer completes officer candidate school and then does 6 months of the basic school. And it doesn't matter what MOS you're going to be, you do 6 months of provisional rifle platoon commander training before you go on to your occupational field training. But with that, I want to get into a little more operational talk about CA and information. I mean, as operational as we can at the unclassified level. But can each of you talk broadly about an example of how Marine CA was, is, or should be integrated with OIE? Or can you speak on how CA can be employed in competition and how it can be used for influence? And then, of course, I don't want to box Major Toney, but feel free, everyone, to speak broadly about CA and information. And of course, Major Toney, if you want to add the public and private sector relationships as it relates to the subject, please feel free, but open-ended. This is the last scripted question before we go to the chat box for questions. So I'll turn it over to the senior influence officer in the room.
By senior, you mean the oldest? Probably both. So I was thinking about this question, and one of the things is we have to keep it at the unclass level. I can say that there are 2 things that we can talk about at the unclassified level where CA has been really on the forefront with integrating into the other information activities. So right now it's I misplaced my note on it, but essentially we're doing the unregulated illegal fishing down in Southcom, and a piece of that was it's our tri-maritime strategy. Really, we're partnering with the Navy, Coast Guard, and the Marine Corps, and we're using strategic communications and civil affairs and some of the other OIE information activities capabilities to really message out what we're doing down there. And I think that's a huge piece. And somebody asks Ben for those specific capabilities and civil affairs by name. So I think that's a great capability and a proof of concept. Also in Southcom and another piece, we had the Special Operations Liaison Officer talk about before the 1707, 1751, but we cross-trained civil affairs, Comstrat, civil military operations, and psychological operations. And our team that went down there in the solo out of the embassy wrote back and he's like, this is exactly what we needed. This is exactly the skill set we were looking for. And so I think those are just some kind of proofs of concept of what we were doing. And I'll pass it over to Brad.
I think that's a great example of day-to-day operations that are happening, or current operations, I should say. I'm going to stick a plug in here for the Civil Affairs Association. I just recently read an article they had on here about the Sons of Liberty and how essentially they were using what we now call information advantage during the revolutionary times. And one of the things that struck me was how they understood the local environment through what we would now call civil reconnaissance, and how that information, if we looked at an OIE working group, how civil reconnaissance through any sort of CMO activity could provide a data point back to public affairs or back to MISO in order to execute something on a target audience for for change behavior, et cetera. So I think that was really kind of eye-opening to view it from that perspective. And I think that if we took that analogy and applied it to Eastern Europe, islands, and the Pacific, you could see how a civil affairs activity would provide a lot of data and understanding of the local environment and how to operationalize that environment for the Joint Force Commander.
Thanks for that, Brad. Drake?
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer. I think all applicable. I think what becomes, I saw a comment about it in the chat, and I think what becomes difficult is like we all want to do things, like we all want to kind of like talk about the value that we add. And sometimes really that value is just in being able to help understand and contextualize, right? So it like might be kind of being a bit of a sensor ingestion point, a making sense function, and then like a plug-in to the larger kind of operational strategic picture. And I think that's where we have to really kind of be thinking in the future, especially in kind of competition. So it's been interesting, like in my time at Twitter, I would talk at like the USMC's kind of Commanders Media Symposium, and that was for like everybody that was getting 05 and 06 command across the Marine Corps. They would come to New York, and like some of the kind of strategic media folks would, talk to these commanders about like their media presence. And you'd hear a lot of them asking, like, well, what do I do? Should I be communicating? What do I put out in the information environment? And, my candid answer then was like, nothing. Like, please don't put anything out there, because we have the oldest and best brand, and we have a large DoD, and we have a large US government. And a lot of times we have a large G20, or we have like a large, narrative, right, that we're supporting. And it's much, much, much easier when you go out to do things to mess things up than it is to like reinforce, right? So I think that's like one of like the things about, as we're kind of talking about like the future of like this field, when we talk about like what, CA and the 17XX fields mean for the Marine Corps. I think like it's important for us to kind of think about like, where the real value lies. And I think it's really a lot more in sensing and listening and sense making than it is about like this idea of like projection. When you think about scale and like the relative kind of nature of the environment. So I think there's a lot that we can do. I think learning how to measure and quantify it is going to be helpful as like we continue to kind of like integrate and professionalize our commanders and our kind of our customers, for lack of better words, with these fields. And then I guess like the last thing I kind of wrote down thinking about this was, thinking public-private. It's really kind of similar. I think like whether, as we thought about like Advantage at Sea, or we thought about like joint warfighting concept and like imagining a future, the current realities continue to kind of like hit people in the face, right? And it's like that there are laws. The laws are not the same in every country. Designations and bodies that develop them are, sometimes, coalitions, sometimes nation-led, sometimes led by even private industry, right? And then like industry partnerships, or even billionaires these days, can be like incredibly, prominent entities that need to be considered, and having a real understanding of how things work. We kind of tried to put this in the MCDP8. Part of it kind of came through a little bit as like media literacy, but it's more than that, right? Our folks need to understand how systems work. And I think that's where CA professionals should be incredibly proficient. Understanding, that if you want to communicate with populations over different, vehicles, right? In a country like Turkey, that's very different than micro islands in Indonesia, and certainly different than we know and can understand in like a more North American context. And so I think like public-private relationships are going to be increasingly important. They're already super nuanced, and it should be our job to be able to understand the fabric of those just as much as we kind of understand other pieces of the fabric, right? And so those were kind of my short notes, and happy to kind of follow up, James, as you see appropriate.
Awesome. Well, gentlemen, thank you for that. As promised, that was all the scripted questions I had. If any of you have any parting shots, feel free. Otherwise, we are going to head to the chat. Nothing heard. So I'll take the first one. It's an easy one from Dale. James, where do you serve on Quantico? So Dale, Monday through Friday, I am in the Mark Center in Alexandria in a shirt and tie. And for my reserve duties, I go wherever the CG of the Force Headquarters Group needs me. Next to, let's see, Baskins, you want to come off mute and ask your question of the group? All right, your mic doesn't work. So in the last brief, I think Jeremiah, this will be for you. In the last brief, we heard about the key lead role of private industry and groups in supporting humanitarian assistance with Ukraine refugees in Poland. Do we do enough to highlight DoD shortfalls and private industry strengths in terms of CA efforts? Not just for Jeremiah.
Yeah, I'll start this one off. And I actually was preparing for this, so I put a link in there. And so essentially one of the positions I had, the command levels working at Northcom in the J9 Interagency Coordination Cell, Center, I can't remember which we called it, ICC. Actually, my specific job was private sector integration and NGO integration. So specifically working with private sector and NGOs to integrate into disasters and shortfalls. So a piece of that we do every year, it's going to be the 12th iteration in the National Capital Region this summer, is the Building Resilience Through Public-Private Partnership Conference. And it's a great way for industry and the private sector to work with the DoD to look at how we integrate with NGOs and work through disasters. Because, you know, in a disaster, the military is huge and expensive, and we're not necessarily the first in because NGOs get there first, and we're usually the first out. So for that piece, I think these public-private partnership conferences, especially this one, the Building Resilience, is such a huge part of this. And we go into cyber, go into everything else. We've got speakers like Brock Long, Director of Homeland Security, Kirsten Nielsen, 4-star generals. But anyways, a lot of the times I'm surprised at how much the DoD is underrepresented there, but the private sector and NGOs come out in droves. So I would just throw that out there as kind of a answer to that. Also working in the Interagency Coordination Center, I know that, and it kind of touches into the presentation earlier about like the interagency piece, especially with USAID, understanding how the interagencies work and understanding their priorities and how we can integrate is huge. But so just want to put that out there. I put a link to the PPP conference, at least the last one. The next one should be coming out soon. That's all I have.
So if you don't mind, I have a couple of thoughts on this. Just like, I think there's opportunities to like kind of to grow those partnerships, you know, similar sort of the way you discussed. I think one of the things that we could stand to do a little bit better at, I know the folks in IMD or Maneuver Division within Deputy Commandant for Information maintain kind of the cyber auxiliary or the partnership with maybe outside folks that provide a little bit of counsel. Something in my time in the Pentagon I certainly pushed folks on is us to think about that and other kind of other lenses as well, particularly when it comes to folks in like our communications directorate and thinking about media and news folks, or, you know, kind of in this context where we think about like interagency, public-private partnerships and being able to kind of like grow our sense of understanding of either how things work or, I think industry would be surprising, it may be surprisingly transparent when engaged. I think a lot of times on the DoD side, we don't necessarily know the entry points. And then for us in industry, we don't necessarily know how to reach out to you all either. And so building some of those connected tissue venues, I think, could be really helpful as we think about civil affairs, as we think about NGO, IGO integration, or managing kind of third-party relationships, or even just how some of these things could kind of work. So that'd be kind of my parting shot here is we have a lot of opportunity, I think, to tap into or to grow some of that, not just at the combatant command level, but like even more centrally in like a headquarters way. And I hope to see some of those things through like advisory councils or other models grow.
Jeremiah Drake, thank you for that. We'll move to Anthony Curry if you want to come off mute and ask your question.
Good evening from England. I'll just read my question back verbatim. How do you gentlemen view TikTok? Is it a curse or a blessing for your work? And I believe it was made in China, so obviously there's a China angle there. But maybe I'm incorrect there. Thank you very much.
I would definitely say, I mean, that's obviously one of those things about one of the problems of living in a free society and a democracy. You have these tools that are available to you, you can use. And it was brought up, actually, funny enough, it was brought up at the Worldwide PSYOP conference, basically the problem with TikTok, because it's who owns it and how much information you can track and glean off of it. And then how do you safeguard against it? You can make restrictions on military members, but then your family members and everybody else is using it. And I saw an interesting analysis of tracking Russian troop movements before Ukraine just from TikTok and identifying landmarks and streets and vehicles, and you could get whole movements and dispositions just off of TikTok. So it is a problem. I have absolutely no idea what the answer is, but it's a very good question.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that a little bit. I don't think I think it's a little bit of both, right? It doesn't have to be one or the other on that. Obviously, it's problematic, as Lieutenant Colonel Root just pointed out, right? Just because you ban it from the service members doesn't mean that the families aren't just going to give away all the same data. And as soon as you ban something, what are young service members going to do? They're going to flock to it, right? So I think just understanding the threat and then operationalizing it for use are kind of the happy medium, right? That's the blessing and the curse. Try to minimize the negative impacts and maximize the positive impacts that can be used through the application, and basically work from there.
So I think those are both excellent points, and I think like we get really shiny object syndrome as humans. We do that, right? And TikTok is just, I think, a catalyst for something, particularly in the US, that we make ourselves super vulnerable to, because we don't have things like GDPR, or maybe some of the other kind of country-specific privacy or data laws, like some of the stuff that's emerging out of the EU or emerging elsewhere, places like India. TikTok, sure, is like it is a big threat, but our potentially intimate privacy data. I know like Dr. Danielle Cintron has done some great work out of University of Virginia talking about, whether you're a service member or not, just how much of information is available for sale, aggregation, and synthesis, right? And so that's not something that we're immune to from any potential adversary or folks trying to understand us, right? And so I think, sure, TikTok's a problem, but so is the three principal data aggregators that package and sell your information. So is your Amazon Alexa. So is whatever, right? And it's an incredibly complex and nuanced world. And when we get hyper focused on one thing, I think we lose a little bit of the big thing, which we don't have the capacity to solve in this room. Those folks, I think, are on Constitution. I think they have the authority, right? The folks in Congress, but. A very interesting question.
Can I throw one more thing out there? Maybe think about it from a public-private partnership thing that was thrown out there for disaster relief. His name is Tom Tarantino from Twitter. Had mentioned that in a disaster, people don't try something new. They rely on what they understand. So if you are trying to message as us as CA professionals in a disaster, HADR piece or something like that, people are going to use the tools that they understand. And obviously, you don't want to put out sensitive information, but we've got to remember tools that are that large, especially like Twitter and TikTok, are a great resource under the right circumstances as well. So it's not all bad. Just want to put that out there.
Tom Tarantino is a CA professional as well, to point out from our sister service of the U.S. Army. So great to hear his name kicking around here.
Great speaker. Yeah.
All right, I'm looking in the chat. Let's see. John Pett, you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Hello, I think you might have answered some of the questions beforehand, just in the last question. It was where the information spaces, for instance, like TikTok or groups that operate decentralized from the area of operation. Would you manage the information based on the population geographically you're dealing with, or the information environment they are sitting in? So we can see very strong diasporas in places where the diaspora group of the population sits outside the people you're dealing with. And how would you get permission to do that? Because it's effectively you're having a discussion with people in another outside the area of operations. It's just a very open question. Have you ever considered that and the risks and the possibilities?
I can say that one thing I was a part of what we were talking about, redefining the area of influence and how difficult it is, because we used to think of it as like a geographically confined area, and then a commander all of a sudden has influence based on what they're doing and how they put something out there globally. So from that perspective, obviously you're either looking at where your users are or where the message are originating from. Obviously, a lot of authorities and different things that are going into play. And if we're talking about US citizens versus, in a geographic area, OCONUS, but it has come up. I don't have a lot of experience with that piece. I could defer to anyone else on the panel or anyone else in the group, but that's I know talked about a little bit.
Just to interject, we perhaps have seen the Chinese doing that, of operating in sort of diasporas of influence a lot. And if we're seeing an opposition doing it, is there now a justification that is legitimate?
I totally get what you're saying. Actually, I think goes into it a little bit in MCDBA, just talking about the free warfare strategy and then how China tries to reach the overseas foreign-born and then the diaspora through these tools. But still, it's the difference between kind of an autocratic society versus a democracy, and then the rules that we have, rules based on what we can and cannot track. But there's probably more to that I don't understand at my level, but it's a very good question. I'll open up to anybody else.
I'll jump in a little bit. It's a very real problem, and it's quite tricky. This simply put, is kind of a Goldwater-Nichols Act, which dictates, combatant commanders have the ability to do operations in their AO. Well, what happens when, other people are affecting their AO through the information environment? And I think that's the reference being made here. I'm not sure that we have a real good methodology for tackling that. There is some kind of global integration that's supposed to happen at the Joint Staff, but at this more kind of nuanced level of maybe using an influencer that's outside the AO to influence actions on the ground inside the AO, that is a very tough problem, and the DoD recognizes it. I'm not sure we're ready to provide a solution just yet.
So I think there are a couple of things to think about, like on previous points I've kind of made too, right? Like Brad's point about kind of the lines that are drawn on the globe, right? Like I think this idea or notion of transfer of data is super important, where the data resides, who has access, like what does that mean, right? Folks that have access to amplification or prevalence on particular platforms I think you're going to see further decentralization of data storage that's going to create additional problems, right? Like people own and maintain their own servers to be able to, whether within, hyper regionalized or even in a global context, be able to safeguard their data from, watchdogs like law enforcement or other, nation states. And it'll create particular challenge. One of the things, or I guess there's two things I think we should be thinking about as civil affairs professionals or as like information professionals. Like one, kind of the understanding of how these things work. How does data usage and transfer work through points of presence globally, through, either highly localized or highly diversified data storage, capacity, and then how we think about, I think in the DoD about preventing harm, and civil affairs actually I think offers like a really nice juxtaposition in that, like, well, what is like also rewarded or like good behavior, right? Like what do we do to like drive stability? What are factors of stability? What are things that, it's not just about being the the invisible hand, or what I saw the Army video is quite funny. The PSYOPers, like, good for you. But like, what do we do, right? Like, what are like the reinforced good behavior functions, right? And like, how do we think about ourselves as an agent to be able to amplify or to be able to reinforce those things? Because I know that's like generally, outside of just the DoD, folks that deal kind of in this space of like influence, attention economy, eyeballs. We're trying to think about not just like identifying abuse or problematic behavior and cordoning it off and squelching it. We're thinking about like, well, how do we just like increase the quality of content or drive people away from things that are problematic by having better alternatives, right? And I think we're going to have to think about that from an influence perspective, from a civil, perspective, et cetera. So those are really complex problems, and we certainly won't solve them here, but I'm glad to hear the questions being raised.
Gentlemen, thank you for all of that. We're going to go to, there's a couple hands up. So we'll go to Basir, then Stanislava, and then I'll read Baskin's questions to everyone. So Basir, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. It was a wonderful presentation. So in cognitive warfare, obviously, it's going to be very likely integrated into J3, but do you see also prospects? I mean, this question goes to the panel, integrating cognitive warfare and counter cognitive warfare, countering it as part of a competency similar to counterintelligence, as part of basic force protection, measure, posture, and training. Second question, typically a lot of the times people think the psychologists are the best resiliency professionals, but I truly disagree. Have seen a lot of psychologists fail because they you really have to earn your stripes when it comes to that. So it's kind of like being a soldier versus being just having not had any combat or shot any weapon. So who would be the ideal resiliency professional, whether civ, mil? Thank you. Over.
Those are great questions on the first part of it. I did put the MCDP 8 in the chat, which is a Marine Corps doctrinal publication 8. We do have 3 functions of information advantage. I know we talked about a little bit and briefed on yesterday, which is systems overmatch, prevailing narrative, and force resiliency, which gets a little bit to your question. And I'm by no means an expert on MCDP 8, so I'll turn it over in a second. But obviously, the thought logic going into the force resiliency piece is to inoculate the force a little bit against some of these pieces that are being directed at us, the fire hose of falsehoods and the dis and malinformation that we're receiving, just old school propaganda. I think that, and I would hope that at the higher levels, that force resiliency is being guided by subject matter experts into those fields, but I don't have that piece, and I will have to defer on the second half of that question because I do not have a good answer.
I can chime in from what I see up here. There's a mandate from Congress to address foreign malign influence. What we don't have clearly defined yet is whose role is that. And so I think that's part of the question is who's best to understand it's happening, and then B, provide the resiliency training mechanisms for service members to understand what they're seeing and why they're seeing it. Those things actually will come out, I think, in the future, in the next 6 months or so. But right now we haven't identified anyone clearly, so much as we understand there's a problem and we need to start fixing said problem. And that's a mandate to my office from Congress.
Thank you very much. And actually, I greatly appreciate the case method, decision forcing cases of Marine Corps. So anyone who's in Quantico, please say hi to Professor Goodmanson if you come across. Over. Thank you.
If I can too, I think just some of the context and thinking about that particular piece of advantage, right? Like there's like a defensive nature. So as we were kind of going through the writing process on MCDP8, so some of the specific guidance from General Glavy himself was in this kind of particular bucket. And it was, we need to kind of get ourselves out of the notion that like we have the inherent persistent advantage to begin with. Like other kind of warfighting functions, other approaches certainly have kind of taken that we come from a position of inherent advantage, whether it's like superiority or dominance or, you name it. We're not there, right? We're starting from kind of a position of disadvantage. And so that comes in a lot of ways from the rapid shift that's kind of happened within our own kind of perception of understanding and relationship to information, news, and what surrounds us. And so, that's kind of, where I want to make sure, I don't want to speak for General Glavy, right? But those were kind of the conversations that helped guide that aspect and the imperative or like the importance of it. And, I always kind of tell the story about, the importance as leaders, right? Like to be able to help understand and make sense of the world that our folks that we have the privilege to lead live in. And I think the media landscape, the digital media landscape, the paid advertised and targeted advertised world that we live in is understood by very, very, very few people. So when we think about resilience and inoculation and education and that imperative that Brad and the crack team that he works with are gonna take on, I think it'll, most Americans don't realize that there isn't one Tucker Carlson. There's 4 or 5 Tucker Carlson. There's the Tucker Carlson that's subject to Section 230 and social media that is subject to the advertising bylaws from the particular platforms, that is subject to the FCC regulations, like from drive time radio to Fox Nation app, which is not, it's protected by 230, to primetime television. Those are different personas that can say different things that have different accountability. And so they're not one person, right? They're 5 people. You can take it on either side of the, kind of political spectrum. Like they're machines, right? I don't think our folks necessarily understand that, the relationship to the voices they hear, right? And so part of this resilience effort is like us understanding like the nature of the environment, the conditions of it, and then being able to help, those kind of critical thinking, critical processing skills as we go forward, right? It's not just unique to the domestic United States. It's certainly present in micro islands in the Philippines or Indonesia, or if we were to be, working within the EU. So just, I think some thoughts there, mostly about kind of critical thinking, but like, what do we think? There's a defensive and an offensive kind of component to this.
Thanks for that. Hey, Basir, I would also offer with regards to psychologists and resiliency, there's a lot of different branches and fields to psychology. So maybe drilling down to the correct psychologist would help, right? I mean, just because you're talking to a PhD in an irregular warfare conference doesn't mean that individual has a PhD in irregular warfare. So just something anecdotal.
Just a follow-on thought, because things may happen, transpire when you least expect it. And during a high-level conference, an OSCE analyst made a bit of a sneak attack in the form of a cognitive assault. And basically nobody was expecting such a thing, and they kind of got shocked. They couldn't orient, so you had to have somebody who's a quick thinker and respond back. So it's kind of like, think of it like an intellectual barking, and somebody had to just bark intellectually a lot louder and a lot more effectively, just to obviously to dissipate that effect. And obviously that guy never found his way back to any NATO activity, but it's just what the person that you would think as a partner, people, someone you're going to be collaborating with, and just bring in a surprise. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was a learning experience. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you. Stanislava, your arm's getting heavy. Your hand has been up for a while, so why don't you come off mute and ask your question?
Yes, thanks everyone very much. This has been a very enlightening discussion. I simply had a question regarding NGOs. I've actually been tuning in and out throughout the morning sessions and sessions from yesterday, and it's just something that has come up in terms of engaging with the civic environment. But in very few sessions, I heard specifically the mention of NGOs, and I did hear it here. That's my question. We keep talking a lot about the expansion of the fragile spaces. Most of the time, we're in this three-block war between conflict and non-conflict. And of course, the engagement between the military and civilian actors is increasing. Because there was a couple of you alluded to the NGO piece, I am just interested in what are some of the self-checks that the military is conducting for itself when it comes to its training or what you do in the schoolhouse or your engagements and missions, to reassure NGOs that you are a valuable partner, you have something to bring to the table. It's not all about classifying information and lethality. You actually do have a worthwhile presence, and you have something to offer them, and of course vice versa. The question I would pose to them if they were in the room. But essentially, how do we go about changing around our approaches to engaging with civic actors as the space itself is changing, and making it more collaborative and just more conducive to wanting to work together?
I'll go ahead and take the first job of this because I did bring up the NGOs first. Obviously, I think you raised some really great points. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of NGOs and then some private sector, like volunteer organizations. And these are the questions you raise or the issues you raise are the same things that they bring up. And it's like how to make sure that we're not coming in just only DoD thought. And a lot of that comes down to training. I hate to say it, but like Major mentioned earlier, one of the issues about having like a specialized CA influence force is like, then that becomes your province, versus the entire DoD needs to understand these pieces. When you go to work with an NGO or you go into a space for whatever reason, peacekeeping, stability, HADR, you need to understand that there's people who are already there and they have a lot more access and a lot more understanding of the space that you're operating in, and you need to understand that what their needs are. One of the books I recently read was called The Front Lines of Peace. This is a great book on that and kind of understanding how we look at the lens of how we look at these types of spaces. And then we basically trample over the local people who are already trying to solve those problems, and then the NGOs. I'll open it up to the rest of the group though.
Well, I'll say that I'm glad to kind of hear that reinforced, right? Like this idea that like we need to kind of build some of these as like, kind of core competencies at a much more kind of at a broader scale across our persistent force, especially, looking at some of our operating concepts where we're going to have great distribution, right? And I think the time to do the coordination and the work isn't forward, and it's not in crisis, it's ahead of time. And so thinking about some of these persistent relationships, thinking about inclusion maybe early, that's something I think we could certainly do a better job of. And like part of the annual vice perennial nature of like a lot of our employment, right? Like you're seeing consistent turnover and churn, not just like in the folks within the component, but like their persistence in locations. A lot of this kind of knowledge gets lost. And I think that's another thing that the civil affairs communities really try to do, taking a stab at and does fairly well, is kind of like this information management problem of points of contact networks, trusted, kind of enduring relationships, even in the face of kind of like this organizational truth that we turn over all too often. So I think making it part of our approach across our broader apparatus, and thinking about building and growing trust in times that aren't times of need, I think would go a long way. And there are folks I know kind of exploring that both academically, like within kind of our FFRDC and kind of academic environments, but yeah, it's certainly a big issue.
All right, last question in the chat, and I think it was dovetailing off of Drake's CMC drop. So if you were the Commandant of the Marine Corps for a day, where would you place CA LNOs in other services, other departments, industry? So if you were king for the day, would you want more CA and influence, and where would you put them?
Well, I'll double down. If I were king for a day, I would make sure that every Marine that goes through SOI and that goes through the basic school, or every Marine had a set of core competencies that enabled them to be really competent in some of these issues, because it's going to be a linchpin for success, whether it comes to access, placement, access to authorities, understanding of how these complex and nuanced networks work. And I don't believe, even if I were king for a day, the base unit of maneuver for the United States Marine Corps wouldn't be the Marine Corps infantry. So I think like we need to think about scaled skills. There is a place for expert planners and liaisons, but oftentimes, again, in a small service like the Marine Corps, and like I'm not an active duty guy, but like have seen it enough, the Marines in certain places are speaking on behalf of all Marines and all MOSs, right? Just because there are so few of us. And so if I were king for the day, I would certainly use my power to think about the highest impact skills that should be part of every Marine's toolkit, knowing that they have we're jacks of all trades, and like there are few of us, and so we are called upon to know a little about a lot. And I think the emphasis in scaling those kind of skills and that understanding is the more important piece. So that's where I would kind of put my wish. I defer to, there's experts on the line, and sir, certainly you as the senior, 17XX, you would have a perspective.
Let me rephrase. If you were monarch for the day.
Go ahead, sir. I'll go and I'll chime in after you.
I actually think that was a great answer. The interesting thing is when we put, it doesn't matter if you're CA or you're a PsyOper or you went through 1-2 week like information operations course. When you show up somewhere as a Marine, they think you know everything about Hawaii. They think you're the MILDEC guy. They think you're the OPSAT guy. Anything to do with it, you better know it. And so, every time we send somebody somewhere, whether it's the MAR4s or a COCOM or the MIGs or deployed, they become our LNO. So that's not necessarily the issue. I think it is the training piece that was already brought up. The one piece I think I would change is at least on the reserve side, the CAGs. We used to have a CAG in DC, get changed over to the Marine Advisory Companies, which I think is good. But it would be nice to have a local CAG that we could work with at the McKayok and at the schoolhouse, and be able to just, proximity, because it's cheap, be able to integrate that way. If I could change something, I don't know if I'd move 3rd CAG out of Chicago and put it over in Quantico or something, but I think one piece, just to have that piece so we can integrate better. But I'll pass it over to Brad.
I've put quite a bit of thought into this for 1707 writ large. My way ahead would be putting civil affairs for 1707, same, the joint force components that have the ability to plan and execute CMO. Our paradigm has to shift in the Marine Corps away from the kind of the point that I think that Toney touched on, I'm sorry, that Drake touched on, was the base unit can't be the infantry in a competition world. We can't go do a bunch of ranges, say, yes, we can engage, you know, I'm up, he sees me, I'm down, maneuver, and then go back to base station and sit around waiting for the war to happen, right? If we don't have the capability integrated at the combatant command, the numbered fleets, the TSOCs, anywhere that has operational authority to execute influence missions, to include your standard CA engagement with NGOs, you know, civil reconnaissance, the spectrum of CMO, every day to put this capability into play every day, then we are misusing this capability. It should be in the joint force, both planned for and ready to be employed by those planners, integrated into TSC events. Everything that we're doing in the competition space, you know, from an integrated deterrence perspective, should be where these Marines are located. Bit of a rant. I'm open to any questions, you know, based on that rant.
Yeah, I mean, prior to 2025, when we cut the active component and the reserve component force, you know, for me, I would just say more structure so we can get at scale, integrated deterrence and persistent presence, because able to do persistent presence at the scale that needs to be accomplished, we need structure. But that's it for me. And that's it for the chat. I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank the audience for the questions. I'd also like to thank the association for including us as a panel discussion in the symposium. So with that, Colonel Holshek, Chris, over to you, sir. I think he's rounds complete too. Gonna close this out, going in 5,